On February 12th, a private jet landed at McDonald Cartier International Airport in Ottawa, carrying a specific set of documents that Washington was never supposed to see. For months, the headlines have focused on the loud, public friction between Mar-a-Lago and the Canadian Liberal establishment, specifically the targeted, highly personal campaign to isolate former central banker Mark Carney. But while the pundits were watching the tweets and the press conferences, something much quieter was happening in the background. While the United States was busy building a wall of tariffs, Canada was quietly opening a back door. We have obtained details of a strategic alignment not with Washington, but with Beijing that effectively bypasses the North American trade corridor. It is a story about how a move to decapitate Canada's political future accidentally handed the keys to the world's most critical supply chains to the Chinese Communist Party. And at the center of it all is one man, one specific financial network, and a massive miscalculation that changes the map of North America forever. Watch this space. Now, to understand what happened on that tarmac in Ottawa, and to understand the sheer, breathtaking scale of the geopolitical miscalculation we are watching unfold right now, you have to look past the political theater and look directly at the financial plumbing of the Western world. For the better part of a year, the prevailing narrative in American political media has been a simple one. The incoming Trump administration, looking to exert maximum leverage over its northern neighbor, decided to make an example out of Mark Carney. Mark Carney is not just a Canadian politician. He is, by almost every definition, the ultimate institutionalist architect of modern Western finance. He ran the Bank of Canada. He ran the Bank of England. He has been the golden boy of the Davos set and the point man for global climate finance. When the new administration in Washington looked at Ottawa, they saw Carney as the puppet master of the Canadian economy, the man organizing the resistance to an America First continental trade policy. So Washington launched a highly coordinated, highly public campaign to freeze him out. They threatened secondary sanctions on the specific financial networks Carney oversees. They signaled to Wall Street that any institution heavily leveraged in Carney's Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ, would face intense regulatory scrutiny from the U.S. Treasury. The logic in Washington was brutal but straightforward. If you cut off the head of the Canadian financial establishment, the rest of the political apparatus in Ottawa, including Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his inner circle, will inevitably fall into line. You isolate the power broker, you starve his networks of U.S. dollar access. And you force Canada to accept whatever terms Washington dictates in the upcoming trade reviews. That was the plan. It was supposed to be a textbook example of asymmetric economic warfare applied to an ally. But that explanation breaks down for one reason. It assumes that Canada, faced with the sudden existential threat of being locked out of the U.S. financial system, would simply surrender. It assumes they had nowhere else to go. They did have somewhere else to go. While Washington was drafting executive orders aimed at Mark Carney's institutional networks, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland was quietly dealing with a different reality. Freeland, the architect of Canada's modern economic sovereignty doctrine, recognized immediately that the U.S. threats weren't just political bluster, they were a structural threat to the Canadian economy. If the U.S. was willing to weaponize the dollar against a former G7 central bank governor over a political disagreement, then the fundamental premise of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA, was dead. The trust was gone. And this is where the timeline stops making sense if you are only watching the American news networks. On November 18th, just days after the most aggressive round of anti-Carney rhetoric echoed out of Washington, a quiet meeting took place in Geneva. It was not on the official public schedule. It did not involve American diplomats. It involved a senior deputy from Canada's Ministry of Finance and an envoy directly representing Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. For years, Canada and China had been in a diplomatic deep freeze. Between the Huawei extradition crisis, the detention of the two Michaels, and allegations of election interference, Ottawa and Beijing were barely on speaking terms. Washington banked on this. American policymakers believed that no matter how hard they squeezed Canada, Ottawa could never pivot to China because the domestic political cost would be too high. But one decision made by the U.S. Treasury to threaten Mark Carney's specific climate funds changed that calculus overnight. You see, Mark Carney's GFANZ network isn't just a think tank. It is an umbrella organization coordinating trillions of dollars in private capital meant for the green energy transition. And what does the green energy transition require more than anything else? Critical minerals, lithium, nickel, cobalt, rare earth elements. Canada has some of the largest untapped reserves of these minerals on the planet. For the last 4 years, the United States has been desperately trying to build a friend-shoring supply chain, using the Inflation Reduction Act to ensure that Canadian minerals feed American factories, explicitly freezing out Chinese state-owned enterprises. But when Washington threatened to sanction the very financial networks Canada was using to fund these mining operations, they created a massive multi-billion-dollar vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped Wang Yi and the Chinese sovereign wealth apparatus. Beijing saw the opening in North America. They realized that Canadian mining executives and Bay Street financiers were suddenly terrified of being overly reliant on an unpredictable, vindictive U.S. market. The Canadian business establishment didn't necessarily trust China, but they suddenly feared Washington more. The incentive gap had shifted. So, Beijing made an offer, a breathtakingly simple backdoor offer. They proposed a new critical minerals framework. Under this proposed alignment, Chinese capital would flood into Canadian mining projects. But, and this is the crucial hidden mechanism at the center of this story, it wouldn't come in as direct investment from the Chinese Communist Party. It would be routed through private equity vehicles operating out of Singapore and Dubai, specifically designed to meet the compliance standards of Mark Carney's green finance networks. It was a masterstroke of financial judo. China would provide the money, Canada would provide the minerals, and the very institutional architecture that Washington was trying to destroy Carney's network would provide the perfect, globally respected diplomatic cover. They would brand it as a triumph of international climate finance, totally obscuring the fact that it was actually a $40 billion diversion of North American resources straight into the Chinese supply chain. The public version of this story sounds simple. Trump yelled at Canada, and Canada got mad. The documented version does not. The documented version shows a highly sophisticated, rapid-fire restructuring of global capital, while the U.S. was focused on a political vendetta against one man. That man's institutional legacy was being repurposed to build a bridge across the Pacific, and it is already happening. Since December, there has been a 72% increase in what is broadly categorized as green tech investment flowing into Canadian provinces from obscure Asian holding companies. This is not a future scenario. The money is already in the system. The contracts are being signed. But that sounds stable until you look at one specific number. And that number sits in a footnote of a regulatory filing in Toronto, and it changes the entire timeline. Because moving $40 billion in critical mineral assets without triggering alarms at the U.S. Treasury requires more than just clever corporate structuring. It requires a completely new way of clearing the money. It requires bypassing the U.S. dollar entirely. If you use the SWIFT banking system, Washington sees it. If you use U.S. correspondent banks, Washington can sanction it. Which brings us to what is happening right now. This week, in a heavily secured data center in downtown Toronto, Canadian financial regulators, working in tandem with private institutions, have begun beta testing a third-way clearinghouse, a localized, non-dollar denominated settlement system designed specifically for these massive commodity trades. They are building a financial shadow network right on America's northern border, and they are not doing it alone. There is a third actor involved in this Toronto project, a partner whose involvement proves that this is no longer just a trade dispute, it is a fundamental redrawing of the global economic map. I'll tell you who that third actor is, and why their involvement makes the upcoming 2026 USMCA trade review completely irrelevant. That third actor, operating quietly out of a leased server space in Toronto's financial district, is not a traditional bank. It is the Central Bank of the United Arab Emirates. Why the UAE? Because the UAE is one of the founding members of a digital currency initiative known as Project mBridge, a platform built in partnership with the Bank for International Settlements and, crucially, the People's Bank of China. It is a system designed from the ground up to settle massive cross-border trades instantly without ever touching the U.S. dollar, and without ever passing through the New York clearinghouses that Washington uses to enforce its global sanctions. By pulling the UAE into this beta test in Toronto, Canada and China are essentially laundering the geopolitics of this deal. Washington cannot easily slam secondary sanctions on Abu Dhabi without blowing up the entire security architecture of the Middle East. The UAE acts as the financial firewall. The capital flows from Beijing through the UAE straight into the Canadian mineral sector, and the U.S. Treasury cannot do a thing to stop it. Which brings us to the most spectacular failure of the Trump administration's pressure campaign. They thought they had Canada trapped legally. If you talk to any U.S. trade representative right now, they will smugly point you to Article 32.1 of the USMCA. This was the famous poison pill clause inserted into the North American Trade Pact specifically to prevent Canada or Mexico from signing a free trade agreement with a non-market economy, which is diplomatic. Code for China. If Canada signs a deal with Beijing, Washington can legally tear up the USMCA and blow up the North American economy. But this is where that Section 4 loophole in the new Canadian mineral framework becomes the weapon. Canada isn't signing a free trade agreement with China. According to the documents brought off that private jet in Ottawa, they are structuring these investments as sovereign environmental partnerships. And because the capital is being routed through Mark Carney's GFANZ compliance protocols, legally speaking, these are classified as international private equity green transition funds, not Chinese state-owned enterprises. Canada has essentially used the vocabulary of the global climate movement to legally immunize Chinese capital from U.S. trade law. Washington's poison pill is completely useless because Canada didn't swallow it. They just redefined what the pill is. And the realization of what this actually means is sending shockwaves through the highest levels of global finance. On the night the U.S. Treasury's threats against Mark Carney were first leaked to the press, Carney did not call the Canadian Prime Minister. He didn't call the press. According to sources familiar with the timeline, Carney made a 2 a.m. phone call to Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England. The substance of that call was a warning that the United States had just crossed a Rubicon. By weaponizing the dollar against a private climate alliance just to settle a political score, Washington had proved to every Western central bank that U.S. financial infrastructure was no longer a safe harbor for global capital. The dam had broken. And that explains the missing billions. When financial analysts first saw the capital flight out of the U.S. following these tariff threats, they expected to see the money reappear in European bonds or Asian equities. But it didn't. The money vanished from the traditional ledgers. We now know where it went. That diverted $40 billion isn't sitting in a bank account waiting to be sanctioned. It is being aggressively converted into physical commodities. It is being parked in physical lithium, nickel, and cobalt, legally held in bonded warehouses on Canadian soil. You cannot digitally sanction a mountain of nickel. You cannot seize a physical supply chain that never crosses your border. Canada and China are taking the wealth entirely offline, securing the physical engines of the next century, while Washington is still trying to figure out how to tax the paperwork. When the 2026 USMCA trade review begins, the Trump administration expects to sit at the head of the table and dictate terms to a crippled, isolated Canadian delegation. They expect Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau or whoever sits in the prime minister's chair by then to beg for access to the American market. But Washington is walking into a trap Because by the time that review starts, Canada will have already secured an alternative buyer for its most valuable resources, an alternative clearinghouse for its money, and an alternative superpower to back its play. And they will have done it all using the very financial networks Washington tried to destroy. Protectionism, as a policy, operates on a very simple assumption. It assumes your allies are captives. It assumes that no matter how hard you hit them, they have no other door to walk through. On February 12th, on a freezing tarmac in Ottawa, that assumption died. The U.S. government took a swing at Mark Carney to prove a political point, and in the process, they accidentally handed the supply chains of the 21st century to Beijing. This story isn't over. Credible sources. Bloomberg News, the Financial Times, Reuters International, the Wall Street Journal,